The year is 166 AD. The Romans have just come off from a devastating war against the Persian Parthian Empire over control of the buffer state of Armenia. Co-emperor of Rome, Lucius Verus, anxiously waits in the city of Antioch for his victorious army to return from campaigning in the east, ready to celebrate what had been a costly endeavor. Armenia had been reclaimed, the eastern frontier stabilized, and the Parthians punished, but at the cost of a legion and many thousands of casualties. As Lucius was celebrating in Antioch, he received an urgent message from co-emperor Marcus Aurelius. "Bring back the legions at once," it said. The Germans had flooded across the Danube frontier. The 3 legions that returned to their bases on the Danube and Rhine frontiers brought back more than just the spoils from Parthia. They brought back a plague of smallpox that would sweep through Europe, wiping out 10% of the empire's population. This plague would be dubbed the Antonine Plague, and it would have an especially harsh impact on the Roman army, forcing Marcus to raise new recruits out of gladiators, slaves, and bandits, according to Roman historian Cassius Dio. Marcus Aurelius couldn't wait for the return of Lucius and his legions while the Germans actively threatened Italy, so he urgently raised 2 new legions, the 1st Italica and 2nd Italica legions, stationing them at the city of Aquileia in northwestern Italy. It was the first time in 2 centuries, apart from the Civil War in 68 AD, when legions had been stationed in Italy, signaling the danger of Rome's situation. As soon as Lucius and his 3 depleted legions arrived in Italy by sea, the 2 co-emperors began planning on how they would repel the Germans pressuring the northern frontier. Dacia, the only Roman province north of the Danube, stood particularly exposed to attack, with just the 13th Gemina legion stationed in Apulum guarding it. The 5th Macedonica legion, based in neighboring Moesia province, was sent to Dacia to reinforce it, establishing a base in Potaissa. That summer in 166 AD, 6,000 Germans of the Lombard and Ubi tribes crossed the Danube River into Pannonia. Their incursion was met with the forces of Praetorian prefect Marcus Macrinus Vindex, sent by Marcus and Lucius with a full cavalry column. Vindex intercepted the Germans and harassed them until joined by supporting infantry. The barbarians were completely routed, fleeing back across the river, with many drowning in a desperate attempt to flee. With the Ubi and Lombards repelled, the Germans quickly sued for peace, with the local German leaders choosing King Ballomarius of the Marcomanni as their spokesperson. They met with the Roman governor of Pannonia, Gellius Bassus, to discuss a peace treaty. Ballomarius highlighted the Marcomanni's loyalty to Rome since the reign of Augustus, and dismissed the Lombard and Ubi raid as a freak aberration. With the plague detaining Emperor Aurelius to Rome, the governor Bassus concluded a tentative peace treaty with the Germans, and all seemed well on the frontier once again. Before we continue, let us explore the Roman strategy of managing barbarian tribes on their borders. The political dynamics of the Roman frontiers were more or less similar, whether it was on the Rhine or the desert frontier of Arabia. The tribal groups on the other side vied with each other for dominance, and their power structures often didn't last very long. The threat of Roman aggression, or the perceived threat of Roman aggression, was a constant fear to the tribal elites, and that affected their decision-making, even if the tribe was miles away from the border. Rome also played a role in the constant churn of tribal warlords on the frontier. Even small Roman expeditions could wipe out entire swathes of a tribal population, or destroy a year's worth of agricultural output and render a group's homeland uninhabitable. On the other hand, barbarian tribes on the frontier could be allured by the wealth of the Romans, tempted to raid and seize a portion of these riches when the empire was distracted, as could have been the case in Germany with the legions moving to the east to face the Persians, leaving the frontier weakened. The peace treaty concluded by Governor Bassus would be violated not even a year later, when more German tribes came flooding through Raetia, Noricum, Pannonia, and northern Italy. Intent on plunder and unimpressed by the response from the co-emperors, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and the nomadic Iasges tribe joined the surge into Roman territory. This was almost unprecedented for the Marcomanni and the Quadi, tribes who had a history of allying with Rome. Tacitus wrote in 98 AD that these tribes occasionally received armed assistance from us, more often financial aid. But Rome was no longer perceived as the power that it once was, and the temptation of seizing loot overcame the fear of Roman retribution. The Germans rampaged into northern Italy, besieging the city of Aquileia before sweeping over the Venetian plain and sacking the crossroads town of Opertergium, modern-day Oderzo. Countless Roman civilians were killed and captured as hostages, with the countryside ravaged by the invaders. It was as if the gods had forsaken Rome, with the horror of the plague being compounded by barbarian invasions into the heartland of the empire. It was the first time hostile forces entered Italy in 260 years, when Gaius Marius defeated the Cimbri. To counter the invasions, Marcus and Lucius deployed legions under the command of Publius Helvius Pertinax and Tiberias Claudius Pompeianus. Pertinax was famously the son of a freed slave, and rose through the ranks of the army after his success fighting the Parthians in the east. Both generals would distinguish themselves in the campaigns ahead, with their first task being to repel the Germans in Italy. The Roman army marched to relieve the city of Aquileia, still under siege from the Marcomanni. The sources are unclear whether the relief of the city was contested or not, but we know that the Germans were forced out, with the co-emperors Aurelius and Verus leading the relief army. As Roman legions began to gather in the vicinity of Aquileia, an outbreak of plague began to spread within the camps of the legions, and the co-emperors fled for their lives back to Rome. On the road back to Rome, tragedy would befall Marcus, when his co-emperor Lucius Verus fell ill and died under unclear circumstances, with Cassius Dio saying that it was a result of food poisoning, while other historians have speculated that he may have died from the plague that they were fleeing from. Marcus was stricken with grief at the loss of his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, and accompanied the body to Rome, where he saw to a proper funeral and burial. After mourning Verus's passing, Marcus Aurelius was left as the sole emperor of Rome, and he returned his attention to seeking retribution on the invaders to the north, and this time he would take the fight to them. With northern Italy now brought under control, Marcus set off from Rome and relocated to the Pannonian frontier village of Carnuntum, where the permanent stone-walled base of the 14th Gemina Martia Victrix Legion stood. At Carnuntum in 170 AD, the emperor received peace envoys from Firtius, king of the Quadi tribe. To seal the peace, the Quadi delivered thousands of captured horses and cattle, as well as 13,000 Roman prisoners of war. Marcus accepted the peace offer in the hopes of severing the Quadi from the Marcomanni and the Iasges. Firtius also promised not to accept any Marcomanni or Iasgi fugitives, or let them pass through Quadi territory. Despite this peace agreement, Marcus also added a condition that the Quadi would be banned from the markets in Roman territory while the war was ongoing, in case other German tribes posed as Quadi to purchase supplies. It is here at Carnuntum where Marcus launched into the writing of his famous Stoic work called Meditations. However, his imperial obligations would soon take precedence when one of his armies, led by Praetorian prefect Vindex, was defeated in Bohemia by the Marcomanni, with Vindex himself being cut down in the fighting. Marcus, being frail and sickly, would have to assume a more prominent military role, and personally led one of his armies against the Germans in the next fighting season. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, the legions under Pertinax and Pompeianus fought the Marcomanni to a stalemate, and by 172 AD, the king of the Marcomanni, Ballomarius, had sealed a peace treaty with Marcus and withdrew from the conflict. Marcus allowed them to resettle along the northern bank of the Danube, and both sides exchanged prisoners and established pre-war trade relations. Now at this point, both the Quadi and the Marcomanni were out of the war, leaving just the Iazgis further east to confront. But the emperor did not trust the Quadi. Since the Quadi king Francesc signed the peace treaty, he was overthrown by his own people, who installed a new king, Ariogassus. And under the new king, the peace treaty's conditions were violated when the Marcomanni fugitives fleeing Roman troops were helped by the Quadi. When Ariogassus sent envoys to Marcus to confirm the treaty signed by his predecessor Francesc, he offered to return an additional 50,000 Roman prisoners, but the emperor flat out refused to recognize the new king altogether. Francesc was placed over the Quadi by the previous emperor Antonius Pius, and Marcus argued that he reserved the right to appoint the new king of the Quadi. The envoys were sent back empty-handed. Marcus then offered a reward to the Quadi to hand over Ariogassus alive for 100,000 sesterces, which was the equivalent of 83 years' salary of a legionnaire. Half of that amount was offered for his head. The Quadi failed to hand over their king, only sending some Roman captives, but only the old and infirm, or if they were in healthy condition, their families remained captive. Marcus lost patience with the Quadi and determined that the only way Rome can remove the threat that they posed was with the sword. With the war dragging on and the casualties mounting, Marcus Aurelius sent for reinforcements from the eastern provinces. By the summer of 174, the 12th Fulminata Legion arrived in Pannonia from its longtime base in Cappadocia. It would not be long before the legion would be called into action to deal with the Quadi. Led by their king Ariogassus, the tribe re-entered the war, launching a surprise attack across the Danube. Not expecting this preemptive strike by the Germans, Marcus would only be able to call upon the newly arrived 12th Fulminata Legion, plus auxiliaries and elements of the Praetorian Guard to deal with them. It was the height of summer, on an unknown battlefield in Pannonia, where the two armies met. According to Cassius Dio, the battleground was favorable to the Quadi, who outnumbered the Romans heavily, and it was a sweltering hot day when the tribesmen caught the Romans on the march early in the morning. Tacitus described the Germans as carrying spears with short and narrow blades called framia in their language. They could be used at close quarters or in long-range fighting, hurling them at great distances. The tribesmen frequently went to battle completely naked or merely wearing a short cloak. Occasionally, there would be Germans wearing breastplates, helmets, or carrying swords captured from Roman prisoners. The most distinctive piece of equipment was a small wooden shield painted in bright colors. Singing their battle songs in honor of Donar, their version of Hercules, and banging their weapons against their shields, the Germans aimed to intimidate and demoralize the outnumbered Romans. The situation looked grim for Marcus Aurelius and the surrounded 12th Fulminata Legion. With their shields locked together in an orbis formation, the legionaries created a solid wall around themselves, with the cavalry and the emperor's party in the middle. For several hours, the Quadi pelted the legionary line with spears, expending a lot of energy, but could not break through the shield defense. King Ariogassus halted the attack and pulled back his warriors, continuing to encircle the 12th Fulminata and their emperor, waiting for a Roman surrender. Cassius Dio described the Romans as being, quote, in a terrible plight from fatigue, wounds, the heat of the sun, and their thirst, end quote. What happened next has long been debated by historians for its historical accuracy. Nonetheless, we will recount this story as told by Cassius Dio. He records that with the emperor was an Egyptian magician named Arnulfus. Seeking an intervention by the gods, Arnulfus began to chant incantations to various deities, in particular the Egyptian equivalent of Mercury, god of the air. Clouds soon began to gather above the battlefield, and heavy rain ensued. At first, all turned their faces upward and received the water in their mouths. Then some held out their shields, and some their helmets to catch it. The Romans drank in the water and gave it to their horses. The desperation of the Romans was even that when the blood of wounded Romans would flow into their helmets, they would gratefully drink the bloody water undeterred. Seeing that the legionaries were preoccupied satiating their thirst, the Quadi suddenly charged the Roman lines. Spears whistled through the rain, impaling Roman soldiers who lowered their shields and helmets to drink. As the Quadi rushed to hand-to-hand combat, the Roman line was shaky, but kept its shape. The storm increased in intensity, with hail now raining down on the two armies, pounding their already worn-out bodies. The legionnaires, in their helmets and armor, fared better in the hail, but the unprotected Germans took the full force of the pellets. The Quadi quickly broke off the attack and began running for cover in the nearby trees. The storm intensified, thunderclaps boomed in the sky, and lightning bolts struck down into the trees, bursting some into flames. Some unlucky Quadi warriors were even struck, terrifying the German army. It was as if by fighting the Romans, the Quadi had provoked divine retribution, doomed to a violent end. The terrified and demoralized Quadi, some of them on fire, ran from the trees and surrendered to the Romans, begging them for aid and protection. The battle turned into a disaster for the Quadi, with the fighting over by the time the storm ended. Hundreds of Quadi were taken as prisoner, including their king, Ariogassus. The historian Claudian, writing 200 years later, said that while some people attributed the victory in the thunderstorm to his mages and their magic spells, he was convinced Marcus Aurelius's blameless life had won the favor of Mars, god of war. Marcus himself seems to have attributed the victory to the grit of his 12th Fulminata legion. After the battle, an assembly was convened by the emperor, with the men of the 12th Fulminata hailing Marcus Aurelius as imperator. Normally, the title of imperator would have been voted on and bestowed by the Senate. Marcus knew this and normally would not have accepted the title, but this time he felt that heaven had made the victory possible, and instead he sent a dispatch to the Senate, telling them that the Quadi were vanquished and that he had accepted the title of imperator by his men. The Senate, in their gratitude, confirmed the emperor's grant of the title without issue. As for the Quadi king, Ariogassus, Marcus sent him to Britain to live out the rest of his days in exile. Marcus could now concentrate on the Iazges, the last tribe that was at war with Rome. As soon as the Iazges had heard of the Quadi defeat to a single Roman legion, one of their two kings, named Benadaspus, sent envoys to Marcus seeking peace. Marcus was not interested in signing a treaty and sent the envoys away. After the Quadi had broken their promises, Marcus had little trust in their allies, the Iazges, and saw just one solution to end the war. He wished to annihilate them utterly, said Cassius Dio. Once the Iazges heard of Benadaspus's envoys being rejected, they imprisoned him and threw their full support behind their second king, Xanthicus, and prepared to face the full brunt of Marcus's legions. In the winter of 174 and 175, Marcus's best general, Publius Pertinax, led an army of legionnaires from the imperial province of Pannonia toward the Iazgi territory on the north side of the Danube. The Iazgis had anticipated the offensive, and King Xanthicus sent a large contingent of cavalry to confront Pertinax, crossing the ice on the frozen Danube River into Roman territory. The initial skirmish, in bitter winter conditions, ended with the Iazgis being driven back across the frozen Danube by Pertinax's combined force of cavalry and infantry. With the enemy fleeing in disorder, Pertinax and his legions hurried in hot pursuit, keen to capitalize on their advantage and crush the remaining vestiges of barbarian resistance. On the other side of the frozen river, the Iazgi leaders were able to regroup their troops to face the Romans. As the legionnaires carefully made their way across the frozen river, they began to slip and slide on the ice, and it was at this moment when the Iazgis attacked. Cassius Dio recounted this counterattack, saying, quote, "Some of the barbarians dashed straight at them, while others rode around to attack their flanks, as their horses had been trained to run safely even over a surface of this kind." End quote. He continues, saying, quote, "Yet the Roman troops were not alarmed, but formed a compact body, facing all their foes at once." End quote. This tactic that Dio mentions was likely the brick and box formation, a standard formation for defending against cavalry attacks. The legionnaires stood many ranks deep, creating a large hollow square with each man facing outward, and with auxiliaries, cavalry, non-combatants, and senior officers inside the square. Amid the tense standoff, the command was given to most of the legionnaires to lay down their shields on the ice and rest one foot on them to stop them from slipping. As Iazgi cavalry closed in with their lances, some of the legionnaires grabbed the bridles of the horses, dragging them off their feet onto the ice. Or the riders were dragged off their mounts and hacked to death. If the legionnaire lost his footing, he kept his grip on the enemy's shield or lance, dragging him to the ground with him. Countless brutal wrestling matches took place on the ice, with desperate measures like using teeth as weapons happening in these fatal tussles. The barbarians were not used to these unorthodox tactics, and Cassius Dio said few escaped out of a large force. With the frozen ice stained in crimson blood, the battle ended with a decisive victory for Pertinax and his legions. With the Iazgi's army defeated, Pertinax marched into their territory, raiding and pillaging along the way. The Iazgis quickly saw the futility of their resistance, and King Xanthicus came to Marcus at Carnuntum to sue for peace. The barbarian leader even prostrated himself before the emperor, but Marcus did not trust the Iazgis and still wanted to utterly exterminate them, as Dio records. However, the Iazgis would be saved from annihilation by disturbing news that reached Marcus from the east. Avidius Cassius, governor of Syria and a friend of Marcus, had declared himself Roman emperor. Even worse was that Syria, Cilicia, Judea, and Egypt, and the troops contained there, all hailed Cassius as emperor. This surprised Marcus, as he saw Cassius as one of his most loyal adherents. 3 years earlier, he marched an army down to Egypt to put down an insurrection in Alexandria. Why now had Cassius suddenly betrayed the emperor?